The Vietnam War did not begin with American soldiers landing on foreign soil, nor with helicopters cutting through jungle skies. It began decades earlier, buried beneath colonial ambition, broken promises, and a world reshaped by global war. To understand why Vietnam became one of the most traumatic conflicts of the 20th century, it is necessary to return to a time when the country was not yet divided by ideology, but ruled by empire. For nearly a century, Vietnam existed under French colonial control as part of French Indochina. The land was exploited, its people governed by foreign authority, its resources extracted to serve distant interests. Beneath the surface, resistance simmered. Nationalist movements formed quietly, waiting for the moment when imperial power would weaken. That moment arrived during World War II. When Nazi Germany occupied France in 1940, French authority in Indochina collapsed. Japan moved swiftly, occupying Vietnam and turning it into a strategic outpost for its war in the Pacific. For the Vietnamese population, this double occupation brought famine, forced labor, and mass death. More than 2 million civilians starved during the final years of the war. Out of this devastation emerged a revolutionary force that would shape the future of the country, the Viet Minh. Led by Ho Chi Minh, the Viet Minh was not merely a communist movement. It was a nationalist coalition, united by a single goal, the independence of Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh had spent years abroad, studying revolutionary ideology, but also observing Western democracies. He believed Vietnam could be both independent and modern. When Japan surrendered in 1945, the opportunity arrived. In September of that year, Ho Chi Minh stood before a massive crowd in Hanoi and declared the independence of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. His speech echoed the words of the American Declaration of Independence, appealing directly to Western ideals of freedom and self-determination. For a brief moment, Vietnam stood at the edge of a new beginning. But independence would not come easily. France, weakened but unwilling to surrender its colonial possessions, returned to reclaim Indochina. Negotiations collapsed. By 1946, war erupted between French forces and the Viet Minh. What followed was a brutal conflict fought across jungles, villages, and mountains, a war of ambushes, bombings, and reprisals. The First Indochina War would last 8 years, draining France of men, money, and morale. As the Cold War intensified, Vietnam became more than a colonial struggle. It became a battlefield for ideology. The United States, increasingly alarmed by the spread of communism, began supporting France financially and militarily. The fear was simple but powerful: if Vietnam fell, all of Southeast Asia might follow. This belief would later be known as the domino theory. The conflict reached its breaking point in 1954 at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. French forces, isolated in a remote valley, believed they could lure the Viet Minh into open combat. Instead, they were surrounded. Viet Minh troops dragged artillery through jungles and mountains, placing guns where the French believed it impossible. After weeks of relentless bombardment, the French position collapsed. The defeat shocked the world. France withdrew from Indochina. Vietnam was divided. At the Geneva Conference later that year, international powers drew a temporary line across the country at the 17th parallel. The North would be governed by Ho Chi Minh and the Communists. The South would remain under a Western-backed government. National elections were promised to reunify the country within 2 years. Those elections never happened. In the South, a new leader emerged, Ngo Dinh Diem. Backed by the United States, Diem established an anti-communist regime that quickly grew authoritarian. Political opponents were imprisoned or executed. Buddhist protests were violently suppressed. Corruption spread through every level of government. While Diem presented himself as a bulwark against communism, his rule alienated much of the population. In the north, Ho Chi Minh consolidated power, launching land reforms that redistributed property but also led to executions and terror campaigns. Both sides claimed legitimacy. Both sides believed history was on their side. And both sides prepared for war. The United States, initially cautious, increased its involvement gradually. Military advisors were sent to train South Vietnamese forces. Intelligence operations expanded. Funding poured in. Officially, America was not at war. In reality, it was already deeply entangled. Meanwhile, resistance grew in the South. Former Viet Minh fighters, along with disillusioned villagers and political activists, formed what would become known as the Viet Cong. They blended into the civilian population, striking government targets before disappearing back into the jungle. It was a form of warfare that traditional armies struggled to fight. By the early 1960s, Vietnam was no longer a divided nation waiting for reunification. It was a powder keg. In Washington, policymakers debated Vietnam endlessly. Some warned that deeper involvement would be disastrous. Others insisted that retreat would embolden communism worldwide. The lessons of appeasement in Europe haunted American leaders. No one wanted to be remembered as the one who lost Vietnam. In 1963, South Vietnam descended into chaos. Massive protests erupted after Buddhist monks publicly set themselves on fire in protest of Diem's regime. The images shocked the world. Months later, Diem was assassinated in a military coup, one quietly supported by the United States. The South was left leaderless and unstable. Across the Pacific, another decision was approaching. In August 1964, an incident in the Gulf of Tonkin would provide the justification for open war. Reports claimed North Vietnamese boats had attacked U.S. destroyers. The details were unclear. Some attacks never occurred at all. But the response was immediate. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, granting the president sweeping authority to use military force in Vietnam. America was now on a path it would not easily escape. What had begun as a struggle for independence had transformed into a global confrontation. Vietnam was no longer fighting alone. And the war that followed would consume generations, devastate landscapes, and leave scars that would never fully heal. This was only the beginning. By 1965, the illusion of limited involvement was gone. The United States had crossed a threshold from advisory support into full-scale war. What followed was not a traditional conflict between two armies facing each other across clear battle lines. It was something far more complex, far more destructive, and far more difficult to win. American troops began arriving in Vietnam by the tens of thousands. Young men, many barely out of high school, were sent halfway across the world to fight in a land they did not understand, against an enemy they often could not see. The war they were prepared for did not exist. The war they encountered was relentless, invisible, and deeply psychological. Vietnam was not a battlefield, it was a maze. Dense jungles swallowed entire units. Villages became potential traps. The enemy did not wear uniforms, did not hold territory in conventional ways, and did not fight by the rules American commanders were trained to expect. The Viet Cong moved through underground tunnel networks, blending into the civilian population by day and striking by night. Every farmer could be a scout. Every child could be carrying a message. Every footstep could trigger death. To counter this, the United States relied on overwhelming firepower. Operation Rolling Thunder marked the beginning of sustained bombing campaigns against North Vietnam. Day after day, American aircraft dropped explosives across cities, factories, roads, and supply routes. The goal was simple: break the enemy's will. Destroy their ability to fight. Force them to negotiate. But the bombing did not achieve its objective. Instead, it hardened resistance. North Vietnam adapted quickly, repairing infrastructure overnight, hiding supplies, and dispersing factories into jungles and villages. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, an immense network of paths running through Laos and Cambodia, became the lifeline of the communist war effort. Despite constant bombardment, it remained operational. On the ground, American strategy centered on search and destroy missions. Units were sent into hostile territory to locate enemy forces, engage them, and then withdraw. Success was measured not by territory gained, but by body counts. The higher the number of enemy dead, the closer victory was believed to be. This metric would prove disastrous. In the chaos of jungle warfare, distinguishing between enemy fighters and civilians was often impossible. Villages suspected of harboring Viet Cong were burned. Crops were destroyed. Entire regions were designated free fire zones, where anything that moved could be considered a target. Chemical defoliants like Agent Orange were sprayed across forests to strip away vegetation, exposing enemy positions, but also poisoning land and people alike. For civilians, survival became a daily gamble. Millions were displaced from their homes. Families fled bombed villages, becoming refugees in their own country. The war was no longer something happening nearby, it was everywhere. There was no safe rear, no clear front line. Violence could erupt at any moment. American soldiers faced a different kind of nightmare. The constant tension eroded morale. Booby traps mutilated bodies without warning. Ambushes came from silence. Friends died suddenly, violently, and often without explanation. The psychological toll was immense. Many soldiers began to question why they were there, what they were fighting for, and whether victory was even possible. Meanwhile, leadership in South Vietnam remained unstable. Governments rose and fell in rapid succession. Corruption was widespread. American officials struggled to find reliable partners. Each failure deepened the sense that the war was being fought on unstable ground. Then came 1968. The Tet Offensive shattered everything. During the Vietnamese New Year, traditionally a time of ceasefire, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched a massive, coordinated assault across South Vietnam. Cities, towns, military bases, none were spared. Even the U.S. Embassy in Saigon was attacked. Militarily, the offensive was a failure for the Communists. They suffered enormous casualties and failed to spark the widespread uprising they had hoped for. But strategically, it was a turning point. For the American public, the war had been presented as nearing victory. Tet exposed a different reality. If the enemy could strike everywhere at once, after years of American escalation, what did progress actually mean? Television brought the war into living rooms across the United States. Graphic footage of fighting, wounded soldiers, and devastated cities contradicted official statements. Trust in government eroded. Protest movements exploded across college campuses and city streets. Vietnam was no longer a distant war, it was a national crisis. Within the military, doubts grew. Commanders struggled to reconcile optimistic reports with the brutal facts on the ground. Soldiers returned home carrying trauma that would follow them for the rest of their lives. The war was consuming not only Vietnam, but the United States itself. Despite the shock of Tet, fighting intensified. American forces pushed deeper into enemy territory. Bombing expanded into neighboring countries, destabilizing Laos and Cambodia. Each escalation was meant to bring the war closer to its end. Instead, it spread the conflict wider and deeper. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces, though battered, remained committed. For them, the war was existential. They were fighting on their own land, for their own future. Losses were staggering, but retreat was unthinkable. By the end of the 1960s, the war had reached a grim stalemate. The United States possessed unmatched military power, yet could not force victory. The Communists suffered devastating casualties, yet refused to surrender. Civilians were trapped between two relentless forces. The jungle itself had become a graveyard. And as the violence continued, a darker chapter was still ahead. By the late 1960s, the Vietnam War was no longer just a battlefield conflict in Southeast Asia. It had become a fracture running through the heart of American society. What began as a distant geopolitical struggle had evolved into a war that divided families, shattered trust in institutions, and reshaped an entire generation. At home, opposition to the war grew louder and more organized. College campuses became epicenters of resistance. Students questioned the morality of the conflict, the credibility of government leaders, and the meaning of patriotism itself. Demonstrations filled streets with chants, banners, and sometimes violence. The war was debated not only in Congress, but at dinner tables, in classrooms, and on television screens across the nation. The draft intensified these tensions. Young men were called to fight a war many did not believe in, while others found ways to avoid service. This disparity fueled anger and resentment. For some, Vietnam represented duty and sacrifice. For others, it symbolized injustice and deception. The nation was splitting into opposing visions of loyalty and truth. In Vietnam, the fighting continued with no clear path forward. American commanders attempted to adapt. New strategies focused on pacification, aiming to win over rural populations by providing security and aid. Villages were fortified, local militias trained, and development projects introduced. But these efforts were undermined by corruption, cultural misunderstanding, and ongoing violence. Trust was fragile, and fear was constant. Meanwhile, atrocities further eroded moral certainty. In March 1968, American soldiers entered the village of My Lai. What followed was not a battle, but a massacre. Hundreds of unarmed civilians, men, women, and children, were killed. When news of My Lai became public, it shocked the world. It exposed the brutal consequences of dehumanization and the psychological toll of an endless war. For many, it confirmed fears that Vietnam had crossed a moral line from which there was no return. The revelation intensified protests and deepened skepticism toward military leadership. If such acts could happen, hidden for years, what else was being concealed?
Animaker voice.
Inside the war zone, soldiers struggled with morale. Drug use increased. Discipline weakened. Some units experienced fragging, where troops attacked their own officers, a sign of complete breakdown in trust and authority. The sense of fighting an unwinnable war took hold. In 1969, a new administration entered the White House with promises of peace. President Richard Nixon introduced a policy known as Vietnamization. The goal was to gradually withdraw American troops while transferring combat responsibility to South Vietnamese forces. On paper, it offered a way out. In reality, it extended the conflict. While U.S. ground forces began to decrease, bombing campaigns intensified, particularly in Cambodia. This expansion destabilized the region further. Cambodia, officially neutral, was drawn into the war as American forces targeted North Vietnamese sanctuaries along its borders. The consequences were catastrophic. The bombing contributed to political chaos, laying the groundwork for the rise of the Khmer Rouge, one of the worst genocides of the 20th century. Vietnam's war was spilling beyond its borders, leaving destruction in its wake. Back in the United States, resistance escalated. In 1970, National Guard troops opened fire on student protesters at Kent State University, killing 4. The images became iconic: young Americans dead on their own campus during a protest against war. The event symbolized how deeply Vietnam had torn the nation apart. Violence was no longer confined to distant jungles, it had arrived at home. Despite troop withdrawals, fighting in Vietnam remained intense. South Vietnamese forces, heavily supported by American air power, faced a determined enemy. The North Vietnamese army grew more conventional, fielding tanks and artillery alongside guerrilla units. Battles became larger, bloodier, and more destructive. The war dragged on through negotiations that seemed endless. Peace talks began in Paris, but progress was slow and fragile. Each side maneuvered for advantage, while soldiers continued to die on the ground. The gap between diplomacy and reality remained wide. By the early 1970s, the United States was exhausted. Public support had collapsed. Trust in government was at historic lows. The release of the Pentagon Papers revealed years of deception by successive administrations, confirming fears that the war had been prolonged by lies and political calculation rather than necessity. In Vietnam, the cost was beyond measure. Public support had collapsed. Trust in government was at historic lows. The release of the Pentagon Papers revealed years of deception by successive administrations, confirming fears that the war had been prolonged by lies and political calculation rather than necessity. In Vietnam, the cost was beyond measure. Entire regions lay in ruins. Millions were dead or displaced. A generation had grown up knowing nothing but war. The land itself was scarred, poisoned by chemicals, and filled with unexploded ordnance that would continue killing long after the fighting stopped. The end was approaching, but it would not come cleanly, nor peacefully. The final chapter would be marked not by victory, but by collapse.